Emily G is Regional Director for London and the South East at Historic England. She's worked at Historic England since 2001, including as Head of Listing and London Planning Director. She was also responsible for a report on characterisation, which was sent to the GLA when they were preparing the new London plan. And the planners accepted the recommendations lock, stock and barrel. And the Secretary of State at MHCLG, Robert Jenrick, has included characterisation in his recent proposals for changing the planning system. And on top of that, RABA Books has just published a book on the subject. So Emily, you must be pretty pleased with the way this has all gone down.
Yes, we are. I mean, at Historic England, we talk a lot about character and the importance of conservation of places. So we're really pleased that there's a supportive policy framework and indeed a public conversation around character and why it matters for us all and for the future of the places that we live in. Our premise really is that you can't design well for the future of cities or anywhere really without a thoughtful and thorough understanding of what has come before. And characterization is a really useful tool for this. It helps people to analyze and articulate and value the character of the places that matter to them. And this has been done for all counties and for many London boroughs, but it hasn't been done comprehensively across Greater London. And given the pressures for growth in the capital, we really do need effective policies that are backed up by a robust evidence base. And this really must include a thorough understanding of character. As you say, Peter, we commissioned a report in 2015, which was called Character and Density. It's something that Allies and Morrison did for us. And as you say, recently turned into a really gorgeous and useful book. And this was essentially to review London's different character types and to provide the aforementioned evidence, and I say it's so important here, about how we can deliver growth while also protecting and indeed enhancing the places that are so special within London, our neighbourhoods and localities. And this report showed us a number of interesting things. It showed that some of the most historic areas are those with the highest densities in London, that London's character is much greener than with international comparators when you compare it, and that all character types are capable of densification, provided it's done sensitively. And these are really important messages for us at Historic England, and they help to stress the value of building and increasing density in our cities with good growth, but also doing it in a way that really respects the character and the interestingness of the places where we live and work. So yes, as you say, this research, we fed that to the GLA, we shared that with colleagues there as they were going through their process of reviewing and updating the London plan. And we are really pleased that the GLA has put this understanding of character at the heart of their new design policies. And this character-led approach to thinking about what areas and scale are right for growth really helps to sustain the special qualities of London's neighbourhood and places. And we're also really pleased that heritage is embedded in the London plan's concept of good growth and sustainable development. And we see this, for example, in design policy that promotes a character-led approach to borough-level planning for growth. For example, requiring heritage character assessments in advance of that. And yes, you also touched on the planning white paper. And again, we're really pleased that this emphasizes that plans should be informed by a clear understanding of the historic environment. We know that understanding character is so important for establishing local definitions of tall buildings, for example, and it helps with a design-led approach to site capacities and also helps to inform design codes. So the planning white paper talks about a framework for quality and also using community preferences to work out the building types that reflect local character, helping to provide a sense of place for planning and design in those places.
If one takes an example, say, of somewhere like Canary Wharf, which I would think one would say now is a part of London's character because it reflects a very particular time in recent economic history, that of Big Bang. So even though it has more the character, one might say, of Lower Manhattan and Tower Hamlets, what do you think the planners today would make of that if it was proposed?
London, as we know, is not traditionally a high-rise city, but some high-rise clusters have developed since the 1950s, occasionally resulting in pretty dramatic juxtapositions between old and new. Perhaps the most striking is the example of Canary Wharf, as seen from the top of the Greenwich World Heritage Site. And the current approach, supported by the London Plan, is that careful consideration, must be given to the location of potential new tall buildings, and that the growth of existing clusters should be really carefully controlled to protect London's sensitive heritage. And as I mentioned earlier, understanding what's special about places and using this to inform new development is the approach now very happily embedded in the new London Plan policies. And these policies will help us to understand what people value about a place, and will also help us to inform new development that has a real sense of identity, and not anywheresville is what we're trying to avoid. It's really building on what's special about a particular place. And the policy delivers this through a plan-led approach, which is something that we really strongly advocate. This is particularly important for considering the location and design of tall buildings. It also means that heritage considerations can be engaged with early on in the planning process when growth strategies are being developed. And it allows harm to be avoided, and indeed to come up with opportunities for enhancing heritage, to build those in from the beginning. And it also gives communities a greater say in the process. And we think this plan-led approach will discourage tall buildings in the wrong places and give much greater certainty about the height and location of tall buildings to developers and to local authorities, meaning that much large-scale development really can proceed, particularly in places such as Canary Wharf, based on a really good understanding of potential impacts on the historic environment. And this understanding means we can minimize harm to highly sensitive assets. And Greenwich Park is a really good example of that. Just thinking about Docklands, which you mentioned there. I mean, of course, development started there in the 1980s after the docks closed, and quite dramatically, the great mercantile prowess and character of the Victorian docks was replaced almost visually at first glance very completely by sort of later 20th century financial prowess and power. But I think London is in part characterized by areas like this at Canary Wharf, where growth and decline of different industries over time has changed, and historically new development has often been layered upon the existing historic landscapes across the capital. And how old plays with new here is actually a really London condition as well. That kind of that juxtaposition that you referred to is really bold here. And when you look beyond the great sort of shiny towers that one sees at first glance when looking at Canary Wharf, there is of course a deeply interesting heritage here. There are surviving late Georgian warehouses listed at Grade 1 with all the complex and complicated history that these convey. There's a parade of almost sublime kind of early and mid 20th century cranes that were listed, and are poignantly kind of redolent of a vanished industry now in that place. And of course, we've got some really interesting examples of 1980s architecture, which we've listed as part of a postmodern thematic a couple of years ago. These include a number of works of private housing, including CZWG's Cascades, which was nicknamed at the time the Yuppie Towers, and of course that magical ancient, as it were, temple of infrastructure, John Outram's Isle of Dogs pumping station, which is listed a Grade 2 star. And we've just listed, just recently actually, the private self-build houses of the 1970s by Stout and Lichfield on the Thames in the Isle of Dogs. So we are really alive to the depth and the breadth of heritage and interest in London's places.
And you're a great supporter of the role of architectural heritage as a key part of the cultural offer of the city. So what do you think the mayor and the boroughs in London should be doing to use heritage as a part of the armory of recovery in a post-pandemic situation?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's such an interesting moment that we're all reflecting on at the moment, obviously, which is really important. And I think heritage and culture are crucial to post-COVID recovery across London. The lockdown has really shifted our focus to the local, giving people much more time to appreciate their local neighbourhoods, discover some hidden gems they'd never spotted before in the history of their own places, and to re-establish links with local businesses, of course, as well. And our cultural heritage is a huge draw for visitors and the tourism economy. So when that can restart, it'll be a really important factor to get people coming here to seeing the historic wonders of London, and also a really compelling reason for people to go back to work in town, where they can experience the sort of heritage-rich, high-density historic areas where and public realm where they worked before. And it's places as much as activities, I think, that really draw people in. And people like interesting, well-designed old places with character and identity. And I think that's a really important part of kind of post-COVID recovery generally, and that we should take this opportunity to centre the historic environment in our recovery plans, both across London and in individual boroughs. And this includes parks, high streets, and a number of local institutions, which are sort of very much at the forefront of that. So, for example, our heritage action zones in Sutton and in the Walworth Road in Southwark, these are helping to demonstrate heritage-led regeneration of high streets, focusing on the role of high streets at the heart of their local communities, often valued for their individuality and diversity rather than sort of out-of-town shopping areas. And the focus on high streets, which were obviously already in decline, as we know, has been given much greater urgency by the pandemic. And this is very much at the heart of our High Street Heritage Action Zone programme that we're rolling out nationally. There are 5 in London. So we're funding these and working in partnership with local authorities and community groups in London. Just so you know, there's one in Tottenham High Street, one in Tower Hamlets, Wentworth Market, former Petticoat Lane Market, in Woolwich High Street, Harlesden High Road, and South Norwood, where also the GLA is very much involved as a major funder. And these schemes are really thinking about how to restore confidence in the high streets with imaginative public realm and also public programming to get people back into places and enjoying them out and about. And I think the other thing to mention, of course, is that the value of local parks and green spaces for community well-being has been hugely highlighted by the pandemic. And these places are almost always rich in heritage and have a very important role to play in part of our sort of recovery from the pandemic, both in response to long-term changes that will come from this about using green space and being out more, but also in response to climate change. So there's a lot to be said about heritage parks here as well. And recognizing this, we're working with a number of boroughs on some heritage-led regeneration schemes in historic public parks, and working with boroughs on community-focused regeneration, which we're involved as a funder through grant aid, but also sharing the experience of colleagues in our team. For example, at Crystal Palace Park, again, working with the GLA and with London Borough of Bromley, and at Gunnersbury Park with the London boroughs of Ealing and Hounslow. And I think I would just, in conclusion, just say that really the diversity of our vibrant capital, with its over 600 high street centres, new communities can also really come together around an existing place that they love and identify with. And heritage buildings are often very much at the heart of that. For example, the Refugee Support Network, which is being based in a former historic bank on Harlesden High Street. These historic buildings at the heart of our places where we live have a really important role in underpinning and strengthening identity with local high streets. And cities and towns, of course, have always developed in response to crisis, thinking about the capital from Great Fire to various epidemics, which has helped to shape the landscape and the design of our great capital, and it will adapt, of course. But London's heritage is such a fundamental part of the capital's recovery because it contributes so much to our economy. We know that we've got good evidence base to support that, but also to our sense of well-being and our sense of belonging. So much of the historic environment is out there in the public realm. It's in the open air. People feel confident going back to high streets, to parks. It's all around us. And I think it very much will be the sustainable, comforting and creative backdrop to the recovery in London.
So the idea of retrofit rather than always building new is catching on, largely because of the embodied carbon that are in existing structures. Now, there's an increasing number of very high quality hybrid architectural projects being seen these days, like the V&A by Amanda Levitt, the RA by David Chipperfield, Royal Opera House, Museum of London by Stanton Williams. How do you get the right balance between old and new? I saw the other day that all that is left of the US Embassy by Ira Saarinen building at the moment is just an external concrete structure held up by scaffolding. How do we get that balance right?
Yeah, well, a balance is absolutely the right word there, Peter, and it's paramount to get that right between old and new, and it really does require a really clear and solid understanding of significance. That's the starting point for all these conversations. What is the significance of a building, of a place? And proposals need to be really thoughtful and creative about retaining and indeed enhancing that significance. We take great care at Historic England, particularly in our modern approach to listing, to provide certainty for owners on where the specialness is, what's the most important part of the building or site, and indeed where it isn't, where there's greater flexibility. And we use this as a way of providing a helpful basis, a sort of solid shared understanding of significance before having these conversations about the kind of exciting schemes that you referred to. You referred to a number of schemes there which show really positive ways that historic buildings that we all know and love have been adapted, and they've all started from a really clear understanding of significance, with input from us, from our teams, and also with the local planning authorities, and working with really imaginative and creative architects who value and respect the interests of the buildings that survive there. It's often about balance. So, for example, at the V&A you mentioned, we accepted some harm to the Edwardian Aston Webb screen there, in order to enhance the visitor museum, the Victoria Museum, and to bring visitors in to much increase access into the new courtyard. Likewise, at the Royal Academy, the new elegant new structure that links those two historic buildings was really about improving access between the two, but also bringing underused spaces back into a very creative way of being used and incorporated again. And at the Museum of London, that's a really exemplary project in our view, where the existing buildings are being retained and enhanced with some creative new design where appropriate, but really just thinking about what's important and special about that very London place. The US Embassy, you mentioned that, it's an interesting one. It was very much led by the listing. We looked very thoroughly at that building and knew that the significance largely rested in Saarinen wonderful facade to Grosvenor Square, and in a very limited way in some of the special interiors that survived. So it's an approach of being really driven and led by what's significant about the place, and also trying to bring in greater public access, which of course the new hotel will do there. And another example I would cite is 1 Finsbury Avenue. So the Arup Associates building from the early 1980s at Broadgate, led on by Peter Foggo. And that's an example where AHMM have adapted and thought newly about bringing that building back into a slightly different use, but restoring public access through the building, and a really wonderful imaginative sort of centerpiece by Morag Myerscough, which brings sort of a new way of thinking about office life in that example of a very recent listed building. But you led really on thinking about the importance of retrofit, and I think the environmental imperative of all of this is crucial to us. And at Historic England, we recognise really fully the urgent need for positive action here. We're committed to researching and indeed promoting the role that cultural heritage can play in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And colleagues have been doing some really important work on this area, research with others, thinking about ways that we can do this. And there's lots of guidance on our website, which I encourage you to look at. We know that buildings are the third largest emitters of carbon in the UK, and we know that 1/5 of all homes in this country are over 100 years old. So it's really important that we take steps to make our homes greener. There's no single solution to all of this, but one simple thing every homeowner can do is to really keep on top of repair and maintenance at home to improve the lifespan of houses. That's something that we can all do. And we can avoid wasting energy and carbon by reusing and recycling existing buildings and building materials. And we're really pleased, of course, that New London Architecture has led the way on this, so by celebrating the craft and the creativity that architects can bring, as well as the environmental benefits, of course, to retrofitting homes through the Don't Move, Improve. We're really glad to be a part of that this year. And I think a careful, well thought through retrofit can save energy and carbon, and keep the heritage value of buildings alive. And we advocate a think first rather than fabric first approach, to really take time to take a look at how the building is used, the fabric, everything that's there, how people use and operate in it before attempting a retrofit, because they need to really be done in a way that will last. Otherwise, you're sort of reducing the benefits of a successful retrofit. But we know that there's some wonderful, thoughtful examples of people reusing that. And the historic environment, of course, is adaptable. We've seen that for centuries. Larger buildings can be subdivided. Many former industrial buildings like warehouses, mills, factories have been converted both for housing, but also for community functions and for workspaces. And of course, they often have a wonderful sense of history with them and of place. And it can be a very exciting challenge for architects to really get their teeth into, how to use their skills to use what's there, build on the significance, but create something new and wonderful. And we've seen that in a number of those examples you cite. So we're really keen to work with architects and with custodians of these sites together and think about how we can bring new life into the wonderful historic environment that's around us.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Emily, for your insights, and congratulations on getting characterization built into the planning system so effectively. I think that we've always both agreed that tall buildings in the right buildings in the right place. Okay, I think that now this characterization element will actually help ensure that that actually is the case.
Thank you, Peter, very much.